Well, it's positive news that the economy continues to grow, that jobs have been created, 500,000 jobs in the private sector in the last year, and it's positive news that our exports and investment are growing. But of course, there are big economic challenges out there in the world, and I think Britain is navigating its way through those challenges as a stable place to do business.
Do you think that this number was artificially low because of special factors, royal wedding, warm weather, things like that?
Well, personally, I'm not going to get into interpreting the detail of the figures. I leave that to the Independent Office for National Statistics, who've made their observations about special factors. My job is to steer a course in the future that sees the productive capacity of the economy grow, i.e. we're better at making things, we have a more balanced economy, but also that we're a stable place to do business, stable place to live, and that means having a credible plan to deal with our debts.
Can I just clarify though, do you find the 0.2 number personally, when you saw it yesterday, did you find it disappointing?
Well, I'm not an economic forecaster, so I've set up an independent body, the Office for Budget Responsibility, to do our economic forecast. We've got independent statistics office as well. And my job is to get the policy mix right for the future, and not to be driven by this week's number or next week's number, but to get the long-term plan right. And I think we have got the long-term plan right, because you can see over the last few months what has happened in other countries that have not got credible plans to either grow their economies or deal with their debts. It has led to huge instability. Britain has been protected from that, and the practical consequence is lower interest rates for families and businesses.
I just wonder whether you, in your position, from your vantage point atop the economy, see or can detect a potential change in the temperature of the British economy. That this is not just one figure, it's been a series of figures going back 3 quarters now. And even if you take your favourite number about jobs being created in the economy, most of those jobs were created in the first half of that, under the previous regime and in the first few months of your government. So might there just have been a change in the British economic temperature, for whatever reason, in September that you should notice and not blind yourself to?
I don't think there's been a particular change in the British economic temperature that's particular to Britain. I mean, there's no doubt that the world conditions have become a lot more challenging in the last few months. There's been a huge increase in the oil price, which personally I think has had the biggest impact on consumer confidence, both in Britain and in countries like America. And of course, we've had the instability in the Eurozone. Today, we have that ongoing debate in the United States about how they deal with their debts. So it's a more challenging economic environment, but I have to say, the real challenge for our country has been coming out of a very deep recession, a very big banking crisis, the fact we're carrying a larger budget deficit than any other major economy in the world. These things were true a year or two ago, but I think perhaps people thought we could just shrug them off. And I said at the time, this is a difficult road we've got to walk down, but it is the only road we can walk down, because the alternative is instability, economic chaos, real problems for families and businesses, and we are seeking to avoid that.
So you've described some events that are pretty epic, economically speaking, in the Eurozone in America and the oil price. I guess what people at home might think is, if these events continue with the frequency that we've seen them, will you not react flexibly to what you see? Will you not alter the plan, not transform it, but alter the plan to respond to what's going on in the world economy?
Well, what are the components of the plan? First of all, we've got a credible plan to deal with our debt and deficits. And when I first started talking about debt and deficits in interviews with you 3 years ago, people would have thought, well, that's a bit unusual. Why is he talking about those issues now? You turn on the television now, listen to Channel 4 News, and what do you hear? In America, in the other countries in Europe, they're talking about these issues too. We were ahead of the curve in putting in place a credible plan, and that's kept interest rates low. But it is not the only part of our economic policy. We are also seeking to improve the supply side of the British economy, make it more productive, make sure Britain makes things again. And for example, this week we've got a row on with some pressure groups in Britain about whether we should change planning rules to make it easier to expand businesses and build houses. Those are the sort of arguments we've got to have as a country. If we want to grow, if we want our economy to become more productive, we want to move away from a model of growth of the last decade, where we put all our bets on the City of London.
I mean, the economy is not rebalancing right now, is it? I mean, these figures show 0.3% fall in manufacturing, 0.5% rise in business services and finance. It's not happening so far, is it?
Well, actually, they show increase in exports, increase in business investments, exactly the sort of thing we need. And although, of course, the manufacturing figures I would like to have been stronger today, actually, over recent months, the manufacturing figures have been very good over the last 6 or 9 months. And that's been one of the strongest growing parts of the economy over the 9-month period that you were asking me about earlier.
So you're not for turning on this plan? There's nothing you've seen in the economy that suggests you might have to turn, change or adapt? What's going on?
Well, I'm absolutely not for turning, as you put it, in this sense, which is, I think if we were to abandon our deficit reduction plan, if we were to borrow more, increase our deficit more, I think most people in the rest of the world will look at us and think these people have gone completely mad. They had a credible deficit plan. It was reducing their interest rates at a time when other countries were struggling with higher rates. And they've abandoned that. They've given up their stability. And that's why, if you look around the world at all the big economic organizations that comment on world economies, none of them are seriously recommending that Britain changes its deficit reduction plan. What I think we do need to do as a country is do more to promote growth, to build on what we've already done, changes to the planning system, reforms to education and welfare, cuts in business taxes, to see what more we can do to give ourselves a more productive and balanced economy where we're not addicted to debt, where we don't place all our bets on financial services, but we actually have a more broadly balanced economy in the future.
But I don't imagine, for example, the ONS stat that came out a couple of weeks ago about living standards, real living standards falling by the biggest amount since 1977. Since I was born, most of your conscious life. You weren't expecting that as part of the British economy right now. It's happened. How can you support families that are really suffering from inflation and crunching living standards?
Well, the truth is that the recession and the very deep banking crisis caused this country to be poorer. There was a big devaluation in our currency 2 or 3 years ago. When people go on holiday, they can see that they are, as a country, poorer relative to the rest of the world. Now, that happened actually before I became the Chancellor, but I've got to deal with the consequences of that. And as a country, we're all having to pay off the debts. And that, I've said time and again, sometimes people parody me for it, but it's true. We're all in this together. As a country, we have all built up these debts and we've all got to pay them off. Now that is, whether it would be a household or a business, that's a challenging thing to do. As a country, it's very challenging. But there's not really an alternative, because if you think about it, spending more, borrowing more, having a higher budget deficit would almost immediately lead, in this current global environment, to higher interest rates, to more market instability in Britain, to lower confidence, to less jobs. That is not a path I'm prepared to see Britain travel down.
But Chancellor, we already have a higher budget deficit than you had originally planned for. I mean, I just wonder, is the reality of this situation that you might have to alter your plan and in fact increase the spending cuts, possibly increase tax rises? Is that down the line? Is that something we should be preparing the public for?
I think we're on track, and the public finance figures show that we're on track and our budget deficit is coming down, and market confidence in Britain. And what does market confidence mean? It means the confidence of people elsewhere in the world to invest in Britain, to buy sterling assets. That confidence exists, and they've got confidence that our plan is working. Our credit rating, our AAA credit rating, which, by the way, Barack Obama was talking about America's credit rating today. Our AAA credit rating has been affirmed under this government. We are not the country with the credit rating on negative outlook. We are not like some of our European neighbours who've seen their credit ratings fall. And what does that mean for people watching this programme? It means the actual rate at which you can take out a mortgage or get a business loan to start a business or keep your business going is much lower than it is in countries like Spain or Italy. That's a real boost for our economy. That stability it's not just a word from a Chancellor Exchequer. It's a real thing out there in our economy that makes it easier to do business, easier for us to get out of the very deep recession that we've been in.
Are you expecting the Bank of England to maybe brandish more of its money printing weapons? Or the business secretary's been talking about that?
Well, Vince Cable, like me, we are very careful to respect the independence of the Bank of England. They are responsible for managing demand in our economy, but they are independent in the way they do that. And certainly I don't think it's right for me to question that independence or try and countermand it or make suggestions to them. They've got to be independent in doing that job, because that's also part of the global confidence we have in the British economic framework.
Do you think that the deal the Eurozone put together last Thursday has broken the back of the Greek crisis?
Yeah, I think it's broken the back of the Greek crisis, I mean, as you put it, because I think a number of important principles were established last week. First, that the private sector, private creditors, were going to be involved in trying to reduce the burden of Greek debt, and also, crucially, that the bailout fund that the Eurozone created is now going to be used more flexibly. It's going to be used to buy debt and so on. I think those are very important principles. I suspect we haven't had the last of Greece, and I think there are big questions the Eurozone faces about creating more fiscal union, more unity around their budget policies, which I think flows logically from a single currency. As far as Britain's concerned, look, we stayed out of the Greek bailout, which was a very important promise I made to the British people. We have stayed out of the permanent euro bailout because we're not in the euro. But it is in our interest, be in no doubt, that we have a stable euro. So, I'm using all my influence to make sure that they sort their problems out.
With the Irish, you're going to drop the Irish interest rates?
Well, the Irish are a particular case, a special case, I would say. Ireland is our closest neighbour. We are very interconnected as a society, but also as an economy, and our banking systems are very interconnected. So I made an exception with Ireland. I said we should help, British taxpayers should directly help the Irish. We made a loan to them. We've been able to reduce our interest rates because the Eurozone has been able to reduce their interest rates. If we had just reduced our interest rates by ourselves, we would in effect have been subsidising the rest of the euro. So I'm very pleased to be able to do that. I'm not looking to make money out of the Irish. I'm looking to help the Irish. And I'm glad actually that some of the things we've been calling for over several months in the private meetings I've been at have come to pass in terms of the help for Ireland.
You must be quite concerned that something unthinkable as regards US Treasuries and US default is in the realms of possibility right now.
Well, look, I, like everyone else, including the US President and the US Secretary of State, don't think it will come to that. I think there is of course, an argument which I don't intend to intrude into between the Congress and the President about the nature of the deficit reduction plan in America. But they're both talking about the same thing, which is how do you deal with the US budget deficit? And interestingly, some people who say, were saying to me a few months ago, do what America's doing, spend more, have a fiscal stimulus. They're not saying that anymore because the debate in America has changed sharply and is now all about deficit reduction. And I think, again, here in Britain, we were ahead of the curve on that argument. We saw, particularly as we had such a large budget deficit, and unlike the Americans, we don't have a global reserve currency like the dollar, or the strength of the dollar. We actually got ahead of that game, and you don't get that question asked about the British economy, which I think is an enormous strength for us.
But just to bring everything full circle, we have had 9 months of disappointing growth since September, since you really got your feet under the table at the Treasury. The business secretary warns about, quote, right-wing nutters in America. Do you fear that if this continues, if this slow growth continues, and you continue down the same path and don't alter it at all, you might have the same sort of epithets aimed at yourself?
I think people look at Britain and they say, there is a government, Liberal Democrat and Conservatives working together, that have got Britain into a place where it's a safe haven in the storm. We've created economic stability. We've got the policies in place to stimulate growth through lower business taxes, education and welfare reform, cuts to red tape and planning controls that are going to make sure that Britain is a much more balanced economy in the future, and the benefits of economic growth are not just felt in the square mile in the middle of London, but are felt across the country. I wish we'd done this 10 years earlier. We didn't as a country, and partly we're paying a price for that. But I think actually we're now on the right track.
And a number 10 having to nudge you down the growth track? That seems to be the suggestion from some reports today that number 10 might see you as too obsessed with the deficit and not sufficiently concerned with the growth agenda.
I honestly don't think you can point to any other Prime Minister and Chancellor in modern British history who have worked so closely together as I have worked with David Cameron. We are absolutely united in this economic approach. And I know we got used to over the last 10 years, fights between Gordon Brown and Tony Blair. That doesn't happen in this government. We work together as a team, a united coalition team. We had a very, very tough inheritance as a government, but we've put in place the difficult decisions that are going to deliver prosperity and jobs in the future.
If the lack of growth means the deficit target starts to be missed too, surely we should be expecting higher taxes or even more spending cuts. Isn't that the sort of horror scenario for Britain?
Well, I would say, first of all, the public finance figures show that the public finances are on track as we forecast. And second, it's the Office for Budget Responsibility who judge us against our mandate. But I'm absolutely clear that we're on track, we're delivering on our plan, and that as well as reducing the budget deficit, which is absolutely essential for stability, we're also delivering on the growth plan that is increasing the supply side capacity of the British economy.